ዩዥዋሊ በተለምዶ ይታያል ይታያል እና እንደ ፓረንትሲስ ውስጥ እንዳለ እንደ አፔንዲክስ እንደ ፖስት ስክሪፕት ምናምን ብዙ ትኩረት ይዘለላል። ሮሜ እስከ 8 እንደርስና ዘለነው 12 ላይ እንሄዳለን። ይሄ እኛ ብቻ ሳይሆን ብዙ ስኮላሮችም እንደዚህ አይነት ቪው ያንጸባርቃሉ። ግን ሪሊ እዛ ውስጥ ያለው ነገር ቻሌንጂንግ ነው። ማጥናት መነጋገር አለብን። በሌሎች ርዕሶች ጉዳዮችም ከዶክተር ደስታ ጋርም በሌላ ጊዜ ልንገናኝ እንደምንችል እርግጠኛ ነኝ። አሁንም ዶክተር ደስታ እግዚአብሔር ይባርክ። አንተን ማስተዋወቅ አስፈላጊ አይደለም ብዬ ነው ማምነው። እኔን ጨምሮ ብዙዎቻችን የአንተ ተማሪዎች ነን። ከአንተ ብዙ ነገር ተምረናል። የአንዳንዶቻችንንም የአካዳሚክ መስመር የሚወስን ተጽዕኖ አሳድረህብናል። በኢትዮጵያ ቤተክርስቲያን በኢትዮጵያ አካዳሚክ ኢንቫይሮንመንት ላይ ያደረግ ያለኸውን ኮንትሪቢዩሽን አሁንም በርደን እንዳለ አሁንም እዛ አካባቢ እንዳለ በደንብ ስለማቅ ለማታውቁት ወይም በሩቁ አንዳንዶቻችሁ አሁን ኤገስት ፈርስት ይር ሰከንድ ይር ተማሪዎች አናግራችሁኛል። ዶክተር ደስታን በስም እናውቀዋለን ሪሊ ማን ነው ብላችሁ የጠየቃችሁኝም ልጆች አሁን እዚህም አላችሁ። ዶክተር ደስታ የቀድሞ የኤገስት ዳይሬክተር ነው። በኒው ቴስታመንት ፒኤችዲውን ሮማንስ ላይ ሰርቷል እንግሊዝ። አሁን የሶፎስ አፍሪካ ቼንጅ ኤጀንቶችን በመፍጠር ኢትዮጵያ ላይ በብዙ አቅጣጫ ለውጥ ለማምጣት የሚንቀሳቀስ ነን ፕሮፊት ኦርጋናይዜሽን ፋውንደር እና ዳይሬክተር ነው። በኒው ቴስታመንት ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ እንዲሁም ከኢትዮጵያ ውጭ ባሉ ኢትዮጵያ ውጭም ጨምሮ በጣም ታዋቂ ስመጥር ከሆኑ የመጽሐፍ ቅዱስ ምሁራን የአዲስ ኪዳን ምሁራን ውስጥ አንዱ ነው። ያንን በእርግጠኝነት መናገር እንችላለን። ኒው ቴስታመንት ልበል እንጂ ፒኤችዲውን የሰራ እዛ ላይ ስለሆነ እኔ ጋር ሲስተማቲክ ቴዎሎጂም ሰጥቶን ስለሚያውቅ በኦልድ ቴስታመንትም በሌሎች ኢቭን በሰከንድ ቴምፕል ጁሽ ሊትሬቸር አክቹዋሊ ከኒው ቴስታመንት ጋር አብሮ የሚያያዝ ነገር ነው። በጣም በቂ እውቀት ብዙ ሪሰርች የሰራ ብዙ ፔፐሮችን ያቀረበ የሆነ ብሪፍ የሆነ ባዮ ነው እየተናገርኩ ያለሁት። ስለ ዶክተር ደስታ መናገር ከጀመርኩ ብዙ ነገር መቀጠል ስለምችል ሞር እያወቃችሁት እንደምትሄዱ ተስፋ አደርጋለሁ። በቀጥታ በአንድ ደቂቃ እንደ ግራውንድ ሩል መናገር እፈልጋለሁ። በተቻለ መጠን ዶክተር ደስታ 1 ሰዓት ሌክቸሩን ያቀርባል። 30 ደቂቃ የጥያቄና ሰምሃው የዲስከሽን የሚመስል ነገር ጊዜ 1 ሰዓት ተኩል ጊዜ ነው የምናሳልፈው። ስለዚህ እንደ ግራውንድ ሩል ለኮኔክቲቪቲውም መደማመጥም እንድንችል ሁላችንም ካሜራችንንም ማይካችንንም ኦፍ እናደርጋለን። እድሉ ሲሰጥ እጃችሁን ማውጣት ወይም የሆነ ሜሴጅ መላክ ትችላላችሁ። ስለዚህ ሁላችሁም አሁን ካሜራችሁን አጥፉ፣ ቪዲዮ ካሜራችሁን አጥፉ። እንደገና ማይኩንም ቮይሳችሁንም ምንም ኢንተራፕሽን እንዳይኖር ሚዩት አድርጉ። ከዛ ዶክተር ደስታ ይቀጥላል። ከ1 ሰዓት በኋላ የዲስከሽን ሰዓት ሲኖር ያኔ እድሉ የሚሰጣችሁ ሰዎች ብቻ ካሜራችሁንም ማይካችሁንም ኦን አድርጋችሁ ሀሳባችሁን ትናገራላችሁ። አሁን ዮናታን እና ጴጥሮስ ማይካችሁን አላጠፋችሁም። ጴጥሮስ እና ዮናታን ማይካችሁን አጥፉ። ስለዚህ ሁላችሁ ማይካችሁን ካጠፋችሁ ምንም ሳንረባበሽ ብዙ ስለሆን አሁን ወደ 40 እየደረስን ነው። ከ5 ደቂቃ በኋላ ወደ 50 አካባቢ ልንደርስ እንችላለን። ስለዚህ ሁሉም ሰው ማይኩን ከከፈተ ከጀርባ የሚመጣ ድምፅ ይኖራል፣ ይረብሸናል። በቀጥታ ለዶክተር ደስታ ነው እድሉን የምሰጠው። ዶክተር ደስታ በእንግሊዝኛ ነው የሚያቀርበው። እኛም በእንግሊዝኛ መልስ መስጠት መጠየቅ እንችላለን፣ ግን ፍሌክስብል ነው ነገሩ፣ ፍሌክስብል ነው። ሀሳባችሁን በአማርኛም ለመግለጽ የምትፈልጉ ሰዎች በእንግሊዝኛ የሚቀናችሁም በእንግሊዝኛ ማድረግ ትችላላችሁ በዲስከሽኑ ሰዓት። ዶክተር ደስታ ግን ፕሬዘንቴሽኑን ለማቅረብ በእንግሊዝኛ ነው የተነጋገርነው። የሚሻለው የሚቀለውም ሁላችንም የአካዳሚክ ኢንቫይሮንመንት ነው ብዬ ነው ማምነው። ስለዚህ ማንም የዶክተር ደስታን ሌክቸር ለመረዳት እንቅፋት የሚገጥመው ሰው ይኖራል ብዬ አላስብም። ስለዚህ ሁላችሁም ማይካችሁን ኦፍ አድርጉ፣ ቪዲዮ ካሜራችሁን ኦፍ አድርጉ። ምናልባት ዶክተር ደስታ አንተም የሁላችንን ማይክ አንተ እስክትጨርስ ድረስ ኦፍ ማድረግ ምትችል ይመስለኛል። ስለዚህ ማይኩንም እኔ ፈቅጃለሁ ቪዲዮ ካሜራ ኦን እንዳይሆን ማይክ ኦን እንዳይሆን ማድረግ ምትችል ይመስለኛል። ጌታ ይባርክህ። ቴንኪው ዶክተር ደስታ መቀጠል ትችላለህ።
Well, thank you so much. It is a huge privilege to be able to speak to you today. I will be speaking on Israel in Romans 9 to 11. This is a very difficult issue, and I'm sure many of you have been wrestling with it for many years, and I'm still wrestling with it. And this has given me an opportunity to wrestle with it again. And I'm very grateful to Avaya for asking me to do this. And I take it as a privilege. How it was all started was Avaya and other people were with me. We to discuss South Africa matter and to have dinner together. And the Israel debate started while we were sitting there. It was a political debate, which moved to theological debate. And I was asked to make a comment on Romans 11:26. And I refused to do that because just to make a comment on one particular passage, all Israel shall be saved, is a very dangerous thing to do unless one gives a comprehensive explanation on the matter. How Paul thought about Israel and who Paul thought of Israel and so on. So I am going to discuss with you, first, I will start with Paul's world. The topic is Paul's understanding of the salvation of Israel in the light of his self-understanding, his understanding of Christ, and his understanding of the Gentiles in Romans 9 to 11. So I will start with Paul's world and then move on to his self-understanding and then to Romans 9. We will not finish Romans 9 today, but we will try to progress it. What I would like to say here, our discussion will not be political. That might come towards the end once we've finished Romans 11. When I'm in Ethiopia, I hope we can discuss issues, biblical ideas in connection with the current political or geopolitical issues. But throughout our discussion, I will focus on the text. So just to say a few things about my background, I grew up in Ethiopia, learning a lot about Israel. And I grew up in an environment where dispensationalism or premillennialism was very prominent indeed. And within the Kalahiwat Church, the majority when I was growing up, when I was in the Bible school, the majority were premillennialists. So that means that if you are a premillennialist, first, you believe that the church will be raptured before the 7 years tribulations. And secondly, you believe that the church will stay in the clouds with Christ until the 7 years have completed, the 7 years tribulations have completed. And then we believed that Jesus and the church will come to earth and Jesus will reign in Jerusalem and the temple will be rebuilt. And 1,000 years of reign will happen. And after the 1,000 years, there will be final Armageddon. And after that, the evil one will be defeated and then the final judgment and resurrection and judgment. So that was how we believed. So then, quite interestingly, I believe that Jesus would reign in Jerusalem, and because he is the son of David, he will take the throne of David, literally. And Israel, Jerusalem, would be absolutely central to the world. There are still many people who believe that. Whether or not I believe that now is not the issue that I want to discuss. But Israel, in Paul's thought world, is very significant. But who that Israel is very important to understand. So let me come to Paul's world. Paul's world was very, very complex indeed. A state called Israel did not exist at the time, and internal tensions and divisions amongst ethno-religious radicals and liberal cosmopolitans, I called them, I categorized them that way, ethno-religious radicals and liberal cosmopolitans. And those tensions were sparked by the Maccabean, sparked in the Maccabean era, and it continued, and it had intensified. The tensions and divisions had intensified during Paul's time. The main reason was that ethno-religious radicals sought to maintain the purity of Jewish race, religion, and ways of life with all their central symbols. In the Maccabean era, ethno-religious radicals rejected the program of Hellenization, and in Paul's time, they rejected the program of Romanization. So how did Paul understand himself within this? Now that brings me to Paul's self-understanding. Paul saw himself as someone through whom the salvation of Israel could be attained. He was zealous for God and his law, an ethno-religious extremist, and he followed in the footsteps of Phinehas as his prototype. Phinehas, you can read about Phinehas in Numbers chapter 25, 1 to 9, and you can also read about Phinehas in 1 Maccabees. Phinehas, coupled with Elijah, set an example for the Maccabeans. Elijah and Phinehas set an example for Paul as well. So like Elijah and Phinehas, Paul understood himself as someone who was called to maintain the purity of Jewish ethnic and religious identity. He did not want the Jewish people to be like Goyim, that is Hebrew word for nations, or ethne in Greek. He did not want the Jewish people to be like other nations. He wanted them to be distinct, that is perushim, like that is what the term Pharisees comes from. So one God, one Torah, one people, clean food, Sabbath, circumcision, and the Jerusalem temple, etc. All those need to be respected, to be maintained. It is only zeal or staunch loyalty to God and his law that deals with Israel's sins, and that leads to freedom from foreign forces. And that brings about salvation of Israel and the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. So that was Paul's belief, and liberal and tolerant approach does not work in his world. So many of you know that ethno-religious zeal, this staunch loyalty to God and to to land, the Jewish people, the temple, later led to the war in 66 AD, and in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And there was another conflict in 132 AD, led by Bar Kokhba, and that again brought quite a lot of devastation. So many Jewish Israelis continue to believe that zeal to God and his law is central to the survival of Israel's national identity. As I said earlier, we will not discuss politics in this. We will focus on Romans chapter 9, but it is good to remind ourselves of what a young man called Yigal Amir did in 1995. Yigal Amir assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, and Amir was a student of Torah, and he did not like what Rabin was doing. Rabin had signed the Oslo peace accord with Yasser Arafat, and he had also signed the peace agreement with Jordan. Tom Wright probably is right in calling Yigal Amir the modern day of Saul of Tarsus. For Saul, or for Paul, referring to Jesus as Savior and Messiah was blasphemous before his conversion. And any relationship with Gentiles was anathema. But the post-conversion view of Paul was different. Paul was a Hellenistic Jew with Roman citizenship and with Jerusalem education. He moved to Jerusalem at the age of 15, probably, but he was an ethno-nationalist and ethno-religious. Sorry about that. So Paul's post-conversion view was different. As I said earlier, he was a Hellenistic Jew with Roman citizenship and Jerusalem education, but he was an ethno-nationalist and ethno-religious extremist, and a violent one as well. But subsequent to his call or conversion, his entire apostolic career was characterized by a program of inclusion of Gentiles into the people of God. For him, the universal humanity is represented not by the first Adam, that is the Adam of the Garden of Eden, but by the second Adam of Gethsemane and Golgotha. And this second second Adam of Gethsemane and Golgotha, for him, was the one in whom all things in heaven and on earth are united, and indeed in whom the Jew and Greek, slave and free, and women and men have become one. The God who created Adam, for Paul, identified himself as the God of Abraham and the father of Israel and Jesus. For Paul, God designed this program in order to be the God and Father of all peoples and the Lord of all things. It is within this understanding that we should try, or he was thinking about the salvation of Israel. It is within this understanding that we should try to understand Paul as well. So now I come to his view on salvation of Israel in Romans, very, very briefly. But Paul, I think it is very important just to say this. Paul, when he wrote Romans, I don't think he wrote it in one sitting. He wrote Romans in kind of different times, not different years, but when he was writing from Corinth, maybe he wrote chapters 1 to 4 in one sitting or during one period, that may be 1 day, 2 days, or with his secretary. He must have written chapters 5 or maybe chapter 5:11 to 8:39 at a different time. That is the second block. So chapters 1 to 4 is one block that focuses on pistis. I think those of you, I'm sure many of you know what that term means. It could mean faith or faithfulness. So the focus of chapters 1 to 4 is pistis. The focus of chapters 5 to 8 is the life that results from that pistis. And then he moves on to explain issues relating to the religious and relational implications of Jews and Gentiles. Jews and Gentiles who belong to that pistis and the life that results from that pistis. And that pistis is rooted in the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. I think that is very important. So within that, those religious implications, there are salvific implications as well. So that is how we understand Paul. Of course, the 12 to 15 is another block, and chapter 16 separately is another block. So we have a picture of Romans as kind of 5 blocks: 1 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 to 11, 12 to 15, and 16 separately. So when we think about the salvation of Israel in Romans, for Luke, while the Spirit is presented as the means through which human beings become divine agents towards the salvation of Israel, the temple is presented as the place where God's message of salvation is communicated. But there is no temple, kind of physical temple, a place of worship where God's message of salvation is communicated. In Romans, Paul doesn't talk about the temple of Jerusalem, that is. But he does talk about salvation, soteria. You know, that of course is an issue in its own right. Paul does not talk about salvation as a present event. He only talks about salvation as a future event. So you cannot find, there is only one passage in Romans 8 where Paul says we are saved in hope. That is the only passage which can be taken as a present event. But otherwise, salvation is a future event. But he does think about salvation. Salvation could be taken as a political and geographical liberation. It could be understood as becoming a child of God. It could also be understood as liberation from the evil forces. The principal forces for Paul are sin, law, death, and Satan. And liberation from not just liberation from the evil forces, but also liberation from the judgment that results from obedience to those principal forces. Paul also thinks about eschatological justification or vindication as salvation. So we are thinking about the salvation of Israel. So that is how we will end this discussion when I deliver the third lecture. But let me start with chapter 9. So here I would like to ask, who are Israel in Romans 9 to 11? And how does Paul understand Israel in Romans 9 to 11 and the salvation of Israel? Interestingly, Paul does not refer to the term Israel until chapter 9, verse 4. Although in the earlier chapters, he uses the term Jew several times, or Jews, and so on. But his transition in chapter 9 from expressions of certainty and confidence in the love of God through Lord Jesus Christ, that is in chapter 8, verse 39, his transition from that to expressions of deep pain and anguish to the extent of wishing to be anathema is quite disturbing and pretty confusing, really. We cannot immediately be sure about his reaction here, but he may have heard about accusations of indifference to the fate of his compatriots or lack of sympathy for his brothers and kinsmen. In any case, he seems to be anguished at the thought of Israel's failure to accept the gospel of salvation. Which Israel? Earlier, Israel is understood as circumcision, peritome, as against uncircumcision, akrobustia in Greek. Israel is a child of God. This being child is symbolized through physical circumcision, but physical circumcision as an identity badge without the cardiac circumcision, the circumcision of heart, is tantamount to no circumcision. So in chapter 2, for example, if a Jew is not circumcised in spirit, and if she is only hearer rather than doer of the law, and if she transgresses the law, she has become uncircumcision in heart. That is, her heart is far away from the covenant. That is from the parent-child relationship that circumcision symbolizes. This means that she is not a true member of the people of Israel. In chapter 9, Israel is the seed of Abraham. The seed of Abraham, one seed is Isaac, another one is Ishmael. So Israel is the seed of Abraham. Paul says in chapter 9, for not all who are from Israel are Israel. Not all the seed of Abraham are children of Abraham. In other words, Ishmael is not Israel, nor is Esau, who is Jacob's twin. And Paul makes his point by quoting Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 to 3. He says in or through Isaac, in Romans that is, your seed shall be named. In other words, Jacob is Israel. It is this Israel that Paul refers to as my brothers, who are my kindred according to flesh, he says. As I said earlier, Paul quotes Malachi, we will come to that, but he's now saying, even from within Jacob, there are some who are not Israel. The question then is, God called Israel, he entrusted the word and gave his promises. Now he is saying, some are Israel, some are not Israel. Is God just? This is precisely the question he raises in chapter 3. After arguing in chapter 2 that physical circumcision or being a Jew or a child of God is of value if only one fulfills the law, or one does the law, or one has undergone circumcision in spirit, that is inner circumcision, which simply means fulfilling the law by not being hypocritical or not stealing or not committing adultery, not worshiping idols, particularly money, etc. Along this line, Paul argued that if someone who is a Gentile or who is uncircumcision, acrobustia, that is, fulfills the law or has undergone cardiac circumcision, here uncircumcision becomes circumcision. In other words, she is regarded as a child of God. Then he raises the question in chapter 3, verse 1. What then is the advantage of the Jew or the benefit of circumcision? He answers that question by saying the benefit is much. Probably one thing that tops the list of all the benefits is the word of the Lord. That is the law. The word of the Lord being entrusted to them. Now let me come back to chapter 9. In verses 4 and 5, Paul recognizes Israel's privileges and contributions: divine sonship, glory, covenants, the law, worship, the promises, patriarchs, even Christ. They all belong to Israel. Despite these privileges and contributions, there are many within Israel that have accepted the gospel of salvation. Then Paul argues in verse 6, what I meant was there are many within Israel who have not accepted the gospel of salvation, despite all these privileges and contributions. Paul then argues in verse 6 that this does not mean that the word of God that promised the salvation of Israel or salvation for Israel has failed, because not all Israel are Israel. So he goes back to the previous idea, the idea that he raised earlier in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Then he asked the question, he had asked the question as to God is just. Paul argues, no. Because, so as I said earlier, he had quoted Malachi chapter 1 earlier. So he had said that Ishmael is not Israel. He doesn't mention Israel, nor is Esau. That Ishmael is my addition, by the way. Nor is Esau, who is Jacob's twin. And he quotes Malachi. And then he raises the question, is God unjust? Paul argues, no, because it is not a performance-related decision, because neither Esau nor Jacob had done anything, neither good nor bad. So the question then is, how did Jacob become Israel? Jacob became Israel not from works, but from calling. That is, Very interesting. Those of you who read Greek, uk, ex, ergon, al, ek, to kaluntos, not from works, but from calling. When we talk about calling, we're talking about God's act of choosing. This comes from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6. For you, the idea, I mean, for you, that is Israel, are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. So God loved Jacob, means God chose Jacob. And God hated Esau, means God did not choose Esau. The imaginary interlocutor raises the question of justice and fairness again. Paul says, becoming the promised child of God is not achieved. Becoming the promised child of God is not achieved through running after it or wanting it, but through God's mercy. So he had talked about calling. Now he talks about God's mercy. God chose Jacob in order that he may become the instrument through whom God shows his power. That is how he puts it in his argument. Paul presents God's dealings with Pharaoh as well. Pharaoh in terms of using him as an instrument. In other words, God hardened Pharaoh's heart in order to show his power through him, and his name may be proclaimed throughout the earth. In a sense, God hardened Pharaoh's heart means God exercised his freedom to use Pharaoh for his purpose. The point here is from within Israel, so that is how we would deduce. From within Israel, there are some whose hearts are hardened. Whether God actively hardened their hearts or he knew they would harden their hearts and gave them over to their desire is disputed. Like Pharaoh, however, he uses them as instruments to fulfill his salvific purpose, and that cannot be disputed. So here, Paul continues in his argument. I will show you later where he's trying to get to. We will not complete our discussion, but here he quotes Exodus chapter 33, verse 19. He says, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Then Paul puts a question on the lips of his imaginary interlocutor. Since no one can object to the divine will, why should they be blamed for not believing, for not accepting the gospel of salvation? On what basis does God show or not show mercy? What are his standards? The answer is that God exercises his freedom. Like the potter, that is imagery from the Old Testament and Jewish literature of the Second Temple period. Like the potter uses his freedom to make different types of vessels for different uses, for honor and dishonor, God also exercises his freedom to show mercy to some, to harden the hearts of others as well. So that is how Paul puts it. Whether that should be taken in the way I just put it is, of course, a question that we have to wrestle with. But this imagery of the potter God, the creator God, should not be taken as saying that God within Israel has made some within Israel, God has made some for dishonor and some for honor. I think that issue, maybe you can raise it later on in our discussion. But one thing that's clear here is that God has ultimate authority, but his potter's freedom, his ultimate authority is not indeterminate and perverse. We can I would like to underline that God has ultimate authority as the potter, but his authority, or he has freedom and ultimate authority, but his freedom and ultimate authority are not indeterminate and perverse. The same is true when we read that some vessels who are destined for destruction, and some vessels are predestined for glory. So there are some who are destined for destruction. There are some who are predestined for glory. So that you read that in chapter 9, verses 22 to 23. But verses 22 to 23 are some of the most difficult passages that you can read in Romans. But I would like to explain these passages later on, along with chapter 1, verses 16 to 18, and chapter 3, verses 25 to 26, and chapter 10, verse 3, and other passages. So I would like to discuss this separately in future when I get to particularly chapter 10, verse 3. So for now, we will just postpone our discussion here. What I would like to say here again is that God, the divine freedom should be taken seriously, but that divine freedom and divine authority should not be taken as capricious or indeterminate or perverse. So in chapter 10, verse 3, Paul talks about the revelation or the making known of dikaiosune theou, or the righteousness of God, which we will discuss later on. Now we have to ask the question as to whether Paul is talking about the divine action when he talks about destined, when he uses the term destined and predestined. These terms probably indicate, one could argue, yes, they indicate divine action, but some could argue, and I would argue as well, they indicate the vessel's readiness for destruction or glory. How do they express their readiness for destruction or for glory? They express their readiness through either accepting the gospel of salvation or not accepting the gospel of salvation. So in verse 24, those 9:24, that is, those who are ready to accept the gospel of salvation are described as those who are called not only from Jews, from amongst Jews, but also from amongst Gentiles. So this is important to note. Those who are ready to accept the gospel of salvation are described as those who are called, again, the term called, not only from amongst Jews, but also from amongst Gentiles. So this takes us back to chapter 3. So we've been going back and forth because that is how Paul, when he wrote the letter, he started some ideas in chapter 3 and then he tried to finish them in chapter 9. Of course, they're not complete and they continue to trouble us. So I go back to chapter 3. In chapter 3, verse 9, this is in connection with God calling some those who accept the gospel of salvation, not only from within the Jews, but also from within the Gentiles. In chapter 3, verse 9, Jews and Gentiles are under sin. All of them are under sin. That is hamartia, sin with capital S. However we understand sin. Then in chapter 3, verse 22, there is no difference between Jews and Gentiles. Then in chapter 3, verse 23, Paul says they have all sinned. Then in chapter 3, verse 27 to 31, God is described not only as the God of the Jews, but also as the God of Gentiles. And it is this God who is the God of the Jews and the God of the Gentiles, this one God who justifies circumcision, circumcision representing Jews, the children of God, or Israel, if you want to call it. And it is the same God, this one God, who justifies the uncircumcision. Sorry, it is this one God who justifies circumcision through pistis. What does pistis mean? It could mean faith or faithfulness, or that is how we can translate it. It is the one God who justifies circumcision, that is Jews, children of God, or Israel, through pistis, and the same God who justifies uncircumcision, that is Gentiles who are not part of the people of God. Sorry, can you mute it, please? I haven't muted it. It is this same God who justified the uncircumcision, that is Gentiles who are not part of the people of God, through pistis. Then in 9:25, he quotes Hosea. I will call as my people those who are not my people. Just a second. It's not only Hosea. He quotes Isaiah as well, as he also says in Hosea, this is my translation, I will call as my people those who are not my people, and those who are not loved as loved. I repeat that. I will call as my people those who are not my people, and those who are not loved as loved. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there you will be called sons of the living God, or children of the living God. Because it says, huioi Theu Zontos. I said sons of the living God, but it could be children of the living God. Isaiah cries out on behalf of Israel, though the number of the children of Israel is like the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. So Paul has talked about calling, and now he talks about the remnant. For the Lord, without delay or shortly, will make the word accomplished or fulfilled upon the earth. And as Isaiah has said beforehand, unless the Lord of hosts left seed to us, we will become like Sodom, and we will be comparable to Gomorrah. What then shall we say? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness. Righteousness from or through pistis, which could mean faith or faithfulness. On the other hand, Israel, who pursued law of righteousness, did not reach or arrive at the law on account of or through what? Because it is not through pistis, but through works. They stumbled at the rock or at the stone that stumbles, or the rock of offense. So that stumbles means the rock of offense. As it is written, behold, I place in Zion a stone of offense, or a rock that stumbles. And sorry, a stone of offense and a rock that stumbles. And those one who trusts, or those who trust or put, the one who trusts or puts his trust upon him shall not be put to shame. So that is how Paul finishes. So for Israel, we haven't finally answered the question. We will continue. Now I give you an opportunity to ask questions or to make comments. Ababaye, it's over to you.
Okay, Dr. Desta, I really appreciate you. Thank you for this thought-provoking and stimulating lecture. I know your lecture is not completed today. It will continue, and you will underline some issues in your next lectures. But for today, I think it's quite enough and quite interesting lecture. So anyone who wanted to ask questions and raise some comments, now it's open for all. So when you want to ask questions, or when you please try to make brief and to the point, and also just be specific. And you can now on your mic if you want to ask questions. you can just on your mics. If you want, you can also on your camera, your video camera. So I think it's better to go like that. And it's now open for all to raise questions and comments. Thank you.
Otherwise,
Yes,
uh,
Robin, you can. Yeah.
I think I wrote my questions directly to Dr. Desta on the chat, but I can read it out loud if that is helpful.
Okay.
My question here is, shouldn't the end of Romans chapter 8, where Paul talks about nothing can separate us from the love of God, seen as an intro for chapter 9 instead of dissecting chapter 9 up to 11, so that we would have a framework, especially on her new recent book, Beverly Gavin, that argues for saying that it should be seen in the context of Romans chapter 8 and also 12. And it's not the 9 up to 11 is like a sidebar, not, it should not be seen by itself. So should that influence our interpretation of chapter 9? And where does Israel belong in God's eschatological victory, especially in this text? And the third is, where do you think Paul places Christ in the relationship between God and Israel, specifically in Romans chapter 9 up to 11, specifically if they do not recognize the Messiah of God in Jesus of Nazareth?
Your second question.
Oh, where does Israel belongs for Paul in God's eschatological victory?
I'm sorry, I missed the third question while thinking about the second question. Because
Okay. My third question is, where do you think Paul places Christ in the relationship between God and Israel here in this text, specifically in these chapters, 3 chapters, 9 up to 11? If we do not, if we think that they do not recognize the Messiah in Jesus of Nazareth.
Okay. I can take more questions, Abaye, and then answer.
Okay. So please, everyone forward your questions and comments to save our precious time. So please go forward.
I can add another question if no one has another question. Sorry.
That's
I
not
mean,
fair.
since no one has a question, but I have one more. Dr. Desa, do you think uh, Paul's notion toward Israel leading up to this chapter 9 seems that Israel is being rejected, but did he do it rhetorically for the sake to say that, oh, that notion is the idea of Israel being rejected, to reject that notion, like the idea of Israel being rejected? If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
Dr. Desta, I have one question. If there is no one take the precedence. I have one question. Uh, on verse 32, it says, uh, let me start from verse 31. But that Israel who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching that law. Verse 32, why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. It says, based on works.
Mm.
What does, when here it says works, what does really refer when it says based on works? Does it refer works of the law or something different from that?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah.
Imanu is coming, so yeah.
I have question if time allows.
Okay.
My question might be, what is the place of Romans 9 up to 11 in addressing the problems that exist in the Church of Rome? Why Paul discussed about Israel in 3 chapters? What is the issue behind these chapters? Probably, usually, I try to think the problems in Rome because Paul wanted to address the issues there. So I wanted that if you discuss
Mm.
these issues.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think, Dr. Desta, it's better to answer these questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just to answer the first question, Robert's question, I take Romans 9:11 along with as part and parcel of Romans 1 to 15 or even 16, I have to say, because I can see a connection between chapter 16, particularly chapter 16, verses 25 following, and Romans 1, 16 to 17, and even 18. So I take Romans 9:11 as part and parcel of the book of Romans. And indeed, Romans 9 to 11 follows from chapter 8. I know it is an abrupt jump. It is a jump from certainty and confidence and to anguish. That is quite confusing when you read it. But when you try to understand chapter 9 to 11 or chapter 9 in the light of chapter 8, you can see connections. There's no question about it. So I would take chapters 9 to 11 as part of chapters 1 to 8 and chapters 12 to 15 or 16. So where does Israel belong in God's eschatological victory? God's eschatological victory is quite a loaded term. So God's eschatological victory is, taking it literally, it means God's victory that will take place in the eschaton, in the end. When is the end? Is the question. Is the end, did the end happen at the cross, or is the end going to happen in the future? Is the eschaton part of the present, or is it only part of the future? So that is very important to take into account. I think you have to answer those questions in order to understand the kind of the idea behind God's eschatological victory. But I think one could take that when we talk about the eschaton, we are talking about both the present and the future. So God's eschatological victory is to do with God's victory in the present and in the future. So where does Israel belong in that divine victory? Israel belongs, one could argue, from Paul's perspective, Paul is kind of communicating his reset views. His views did not stay the same. He took Jews, he understood, he viewed Jews as brothers and sisters. He was related to them in flesh, but when he thought about God and God's dealings with humanity, his views were different. They were redefined, reset, as it were. It is within that we have to try to understand the place of Israel. So the place of Israel in God's eschatological victory, by Israel, what do you mean by Israel, of course? Israel, the children of the promises, within the children of the promises, there are those who have accepted the gospel of salvation, and there are those who have refused to accept the gospel of salvation. So the place of Israel, as far as those who have accepted the gospel, would be different from that of those who have refused to accept the gospel of salvation. So that is how we should see. If you see it in that way, Paul, his thinking did not start with just Abraham. His thinking went back to Adam. And that thinking enabled him to think about common humanity. And it is within that framework that he thinks about Israel. Yes, Israel, they have privileges and they have made massive contributions, including Christ, who is God, however you interpret that in chapter 9, verse 5, verse 4, verse 5. Christ, who is God, but they contributed Christ as well. So he recognizes that. But in terms of God's dealings with humanity, he is dealing with them now. In Paul's perspective, he's dealing with them now in the same way as he's dealing with the Gentiles, because they're all under sin. They're all under hamartia. There is no difference, he says. Yeah. There is no partiality. They have all sinned, he says. And God is God of the Jews and God of the Gentiles. It is that one God who justifies circumcision through pistis and who justifies the uncircumcision through pistis. Of course, some people have interpreted that differently. Who justifies circumcision ek pistios, who justifies the uncircumcision dia tes pistios. So ek pistios and dia tes pistios have been interpreted in different ways, but that's a different issue. So the third question, where does Paul place, let me read that question. Where do you think Paul places Christ in the relationship between God and Israel, specifically in Romans 9 to 11, especially if they do not recognize the Messiah of God in Jesus of Nazareth. So we will discuss that. You know, I did read the end of chapter 9 earlier in connection with lithos, that is the rock, and then we will move on to chapter 10, where we will discuss Christ there in connection with the revelation or the making known of dikaiosune theou, the righteousness of God. And in chapter 10, verse 4, Telos ga nomu Christos, Christ is the end of the law. So the Christological discussions I will connect that Christological discussion with discussions elsewhere in Romans chapter 1, etc., etc. So we will come to that. You talked about Israel being rejected. I really don't like that idea. Which Israel is being rejected? You know, when we think about Israel, we are often thinking about the political Israel, the geographical Israel. Is Paul thinking about the political Israel, the geographical Israel? In what way is he thinking about that Israel? I think that is very important to kind of think through. And God accepts humanity as their created beings. He does not reject anyone unless they reject him. So the question, of course, is God made promises, and if he does not fulfill those promises, is he a just God? So that's the question we wrestle with. Paul, of course, says human unfaithfulness will not annul God's faithfulness. So God remains faithful. So that means God never rejects Israel, however you understand Israel. God never rejects the Gentiles or non-Israelis. So I think we have to take that into account. If you want to come back on that, I'm happy to respond. But let me address Ababayas. Do you want to come back on it? On the idea of rejection?
What I wanted to say is the rejection, it seemed that leading up to chapter 9 or something, like it seems there is that kind of notion, at least some people, some of us interpret it that way. And then it seems Paul is saying that rhetorically to say that the notion of Israel being rejected, to reject that notion, the whole idea of Israel is rejected.
So the idea
that
of
was my
Israel,
question.
I don't know why that is important. The idea of Israel is rejected. What is rejected? Israel were elected by God. They were chosen. Why he chose Israel, we don't know. But he chose Israel in order for Israel to become a light to the nations. So Israel failed to become a light to the nations. Jesus took the place of Israel. He was sent. Luke says he is a light to the nations. So he basically quotes Isaiah 49:6, Isaiah 42:6 in Luke chapter 2, verse 36, I think. And Paul and Barnabas saw themselves as a light to the nations. So Israel, the purpose for which Israel was called or was chosen was fulfilled through Jesus who is Jewish or an Israelite, and through Paul and others who were Jews as well. So to me, the idea of Israel is rejected, kind of does not hold water. So I would say the idea of Israel is there, but which Israel is the question? Yeah.
I understand. Thank you very much, Dr. Desta.
Okay. And Avaya's question, the works of the law, in chapter 9, verses 31, or Paul talks about he says, "Oti uk ek pistios alhos ex ergon." By the way, because the reason why I took Nestle Island is because they do add there ergon nomu, the works of the law. So there are some really important manuscripts that add works of the law there. So for your question, whether Paul is talking about just works or works of the law, there is an answer in the textual apparatus. But of course, this ergon, ex ergon, is in P46. That's the reason why, sorry, hang on. Yeah, it's in Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, and so on. So all the important, the primary codices have ergon. That's why. But I would say, just to give my own answer, there Paul is talking about ex ergon nomu. When he talks about ekpistios, he is talking about ekpistios Yesu. He doesn't say Yesu or Christu, but he just takes that for granted, in my view. So he's contrasting ek pistios Yesu with ex ergon nomu. But we will discuss that next time, because I want to discuss that in connection. 9:30 will be discussed, 9:30 to 33 will be discussed in connection with chapter 10, verses 1 to 11, 1 to 10. Yimanu's question. This is quite a difficult one. What is the place of chapters 9 to 11 in addressing the problems in Rome? So what were the problems in Rome? That's of course a question that needs to be answered before answering this question. There were problems in Rome. There were tensions within the house churches, and there was, of course, tension between the synagogue and the house churches, those who were following what I would call the Pauline version of the gospel, or the new faith. There was tension between Gentiles and Jews. So how does Romans 9 to 11 help the followers of Jesus, the followers of Christ in Rome? Well, I think if they read it, they would read it out loud when they met. If they read it kind of very carefully, and if they listen to it very carefully, Paul is talking about them, Paul and others, being called not only from within the Jews, but also from within the Gentiles. So the careful hearers would link that with what he said in chapter 3 and elsewhere. And even in chapter 9, he has said, not all Israel are Israel. What matters is the calling, really. God showing mercy. And those to whom he shows mercy are those whose hearts are ready. And as I said earlier, it is to do with the readiness, not necessarily God actively hardening people's hearts. So Paul understands everything from the point of view of the gospel. So those who accept the gospel are those who are called, who are chosen. Those who refuse to accept the gospel are those who are not called or who are not chosen. That does not mean that God actively did not choose them, but they chose not to choose him or not to accept the gospel. In other words, they use their free will to reject the gospel of salvation. So from all that we discussed earlier, I'm sure those who were fighting in Rome, who saw themselves as superior to the Jews, or those Jews who saw themselves as superior to the Gentiles, would rethink. And they would say, God is the God of both Jews and Gentiles. So it could address their problem in Rome. Whether Paul intended, that is, of course, question. We'll never know that.
Can I say something, Doctor?
Yes, Biniam.
Yes. I don't know whether it's possible to proceed to chapter 11 or we hold it for the next lecture.
We will hold it for the next lecture. So it's if you could limit your question to chapter 9 or what I discussed in connection with it, like chapter 3 and so on, that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. So I'll hold it for next
Okay.
time. Thank you,
Yeah.
Doctor.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Can I bring forward my question, Dr. Desta?
Yes, Fanuel. And Imnatab has raised his hand.
Okay, let him go forward first.
No, you go first because you said it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you. My question is in relation to ethnic Israel, especially in verse 27 and onwards, quotes from, as you have mentioned it earlier, from Hosea and also from Isaiah. For me, it seems the quote from Hosea, it looks to indicate the Gentiles. And when we come to Isaiah, it appears like it indicates the Israelites, the remnant. So my question is, which one is remnant that Paul is referring in chapter 9, verse 27? I'm asking this in light of the previous verse, especially verses 6, where Paul speaks that not everyone who is ethnic Israel is who is not everyone who is a descendant of Abraham is the real chosen people of God, which further boils down to what God spoke to Moses in Exodus chapter 33, which clearly delineates some of the Israelites because of their disobedience or whatever they did in the wilderness. So my question is, I don't know how it goes in the English one, but in the Amharic, it says Isaiasm. It looks like something that is connected to the previous quotation from Hosea and also Isaiah. Next, it comes to there are going to be some remnants for Israel, for God's people. So my question is, who are these remnants, and how do we, how should we understand this transition?
Yeah.
Because in Hosea, he's trying to speak about the Gentiles, and in Isaiah, I'm not sure, but for me it appears it speaks about the ethnic Israel. But if not, how could we perceive Isaiah's perception also? Because he was the one who spoke the prophecy. So if Paul is going to interpret it for the Gentiles, how do we perceive the Isaiah's perception? If it is for the ethnic Israel, how do we see the transition? That's my question. Thank you, Dr. Desta.
That's a very good question. I think what I would say is, how did Paul understand both Hosea and Isaiah? When he quoted from the Septuagint, was he thinking about only Jews or Israelites, or also the Gentiles? So when he said from Hosea, I will call as my people those who are not my people, and I will call as those who are loved those who are not loved. Sorry, I will call those who are not loved as loved. So were there some, even within the people of God, who Paul thought are not loved? Why would they not be loved? They would not be loved because they don't love God. Loving God is accepting the gospel of salvation. So God has communicated his love through Christ, and Christ is now the means through which humanity can relate to God. Humanity can build a relationship with God. So did Paul understand Hosea in the light of his new understanding of God, new understanding of the world, new understanding of Israel as well? And when he talked about, when he quoted Isaiah, Isaiah cries out on behalf of Israel. Though the number of the children of Israel is like the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. How will the remnant be saved? Again, the remnant will be saved through accepting the gospel, through responding to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is how Paul would understand. For Paul, the world was turned upside down, utterly and completely. He was a very different man. Yes, he did express concern about his sisters and brothers, but that does not mean that when it came to salvation, Israel had a different route and the Gentiles had a different route, as some people would say. So that is how I would see it. But of course, there are different views, which we can discuss in future as well. Imnatab? እምነት አብ
Yes.
በነገራችን ላይ ጆን ደህና ነው ወይ?
Okay. Hi.
እሺ እምነት አብ
ሰላም ዶክተር
Thank you
ደስታ።
so much.
እሺ
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Desta, for this interesting presentation.
ኦኬ
I have only two short questions. The first one has to do with Paul's self-understanding. You were telling us about Paul's self-understanding on the outset of the presentation. I think your idea is quite in line with people who belong in New Perspective, like NT-Right especially. I mean, it's quite compelling, but for your presentation, my question is, there are also other opinions about Paul's self-understanding, Paul's way of thinking. For instance, the normal, I mean, the traditional Protestant circle think Paul as a person who is highly influenced by Hellenistic way of thinking. So he is always, I mean, portrayed as the one who came from a Hellenistic worldview. So even people who belong themselves to this camp want to say that they want to say that Paul's central theology is justification by faith. So my question is, I mean, for your whole presentation, your argument, your first claim, or your first statement about Paul's self-understanding as a strict Jewish person is an unquestioned ground for your presentation, if I'm not mistaken. So what do you think if one come and I mean challenge your ground statement? Do you think that your interpretation of the passage will remain the same? So that is my first question. And the second one is, I know that you willingly chose to study the New Testament in a historical, critical way. But don't you think that the current socio-political outlook of, I mean, the world has its influence on hermeneutical trends of reading the passage, like the passage that we are now discussing, Romans chapter 9, 10, 11. What do you think about that, especially the political readings of this passage? So how do you think about that? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Imnatab. If I take the traditional reading or the traditional understanding Paul as someone who steep in Hellenistic worldviews and communicated his ideas accordingly, would my interpretation stand? Of course, my interpretation may or may not stand, but I would argue that such a view, where Paul was de-Judaized and he was presented as someone who cared more about the Hellenistic worldview than the Jewish worldview, that to me is already outdated. And of course, there are some who are still hanging on to it. But I don't, maybe I haven't taken time to try to see who those people are, but the majority, or maybe quite large number of scholars would try to read Paul as someone who came from Jewish kind of worldview and understanding who grew up, I mean, partly grew up in Jerusalem, who was educated under Gamaliel, how he took Gamaliel, of course, is difficult to know. Some people would argue that he rejected Gamaliel's kind of liberal perspective. He became radical Shammite, and rather than remaining Hillelite, you know, that is still debated, but he was in Jerusalem. Luke says he was in Jerusalem, and he was really influenced by the Jewish worldview, ideas, and values, rather than Hellenistic worldview ideas and values. But that is not to say that he wasn't aware of the Hellenistic ideas. He definitely was, but that wasn't how he tried to communicate his ideas. But would my argument remain that I'm sure you will judge towards the end of my lecture. In terms of political reading, I do read Paul from political perspective, but I deliberately did not want to do that, did not want to introduce political reading right at the beginning. The reason why I decided not to do is because I wanted us to focus on the text and see what Paul says. I wanted us to hear Paul from his text, and I would appreciate it in future when I discuss the chapter 10 and part of the last part of chapter 9. I would appreciate it if you would read Paul maybe out loud in English, and if you can read in Greek. I would appreciate it if you would do that. So I would like us to hear Paul. I mean, at the moment, I'm not really kind of, yes, I'm focusing on the text, but I'm not kind of trying to follow even the historical critical reading. I'm not being hugely exegetical as such, but I'm trying to understand what Paul is saying. Then towards the end, I will present different views, different theories, and hopefully that will enable you to see where I'm coming from. But at the moment, I would like us to hear Paul. Yodit? Ababaye, you can tell me when to stop.
Yeah,
Can I-
thank you, Doctor.
Okay.
Okay, go on. Edith.
My question is related with when you mentioned about Israel being chosen and not all Israel, and you mentioned about Jacob and Esau, and also about Pharaoh, and you gave how God's mercy and power is somehow is the basis for that. And that is somehow how God exercised his freedom. And I really want to know how freedom is understood in light of those Romans, in light of the book. What's God freedom? Yeah, I was kind of stuck on that idea.
I can expect that. I think, you know, I do not wish to discuss the philosophical idea of divine freedom. When it comes to God acting as a potter, that is the creator God. The creator God choosing certain thing, X from Y, that is kind of the way Paul expresses God's freedom and also God's ultimate authority, as the potter has ultimate authority on the vessel that he makes or she makes. God has ultimate authority upon those whom he wants to have mercy, and those whom he wants to harden their hearts. That is how Paul describes it. So when you read it, when you read, for example, those who are destined for destruction, those who are destined or predestined, he uses destined and predestined, and in the Greek it is different as well. Those who are predestined for glory, it looks as if God is actively using his freedom because he has ultimate authority. He's actively determining the destiny of those who should be destroyed and the destiny of those who should enjoy glory. But that is not how I see. I see what Paul tries to say. I know that Paul's understanding can be taken in that way. That is kind of from, technically speaking, causally. But I wouldn't take it in that way. It is a way of saying that God knew that their hearts would be hardened, but then he allowed them to reject, to use their free will and reject God. In other words, God did not enforce his will upon them. So that is how I would understand it. I would understand Paul's expression of God's freedom. But this is quite a complex issue, and we can come back to it. Habtamo wanted to ask a question. I don't know, did you allow him or?
I think Dr. Desta, it's better to stop here. So let's stop here.
Okay.
ብዙ ልጆች ብዙ ጥያቄ እንዳላቸው ለእኔም በግል ልከውልኛል ሜሴጆችን። ከታይም አንጻር አሁን ኦልሞስት 2 ሰዓት አካባቢ እየተጠቀምን ነው። 10 ደቂቃ ነገር ነው የሚቀረው።
ልክ ነው።
በጣም ወንደርፉል የሆነ ጊዜ ነው ያሳለፍን ዶክተር ደስታ ከአንተ ጋር። ብዙ ሀሳቦች ገና ከምዕራፍ 10 እና 11 ጋር አብረው ተያይዘው ሀሳቦች አእምሯችን ላይ አሉ። እኔም አሁን ብዙ ጥያቄዎች አሉኝ፣ ግን አንዱ ከአንዱ ጋር የተሳሰረ ስለሆነ አንደኛ ኔክስት ታይም በሚኖረን ሆፕፉሊ ከኖቬምበር 4 በፊት በአካል ከመምጣት በፊት ወደ ኢትዮጵያ ወይ ኔክስት ቅዳሜ ሊሆን ይችላል፣ ወይም ከአንተ ጋር ተነጋግረን አሳውቃቸዋለሁ። ይቀጥላል ሌክቸሩ። በዚህ መነሻነት ግን ሮሜን እያነበብን እነዚህ 3ቱ ምዕራፎች እያነበብን ይሄ ሌክቸር ሪከርዲንጉንም ዋትሳፕ ግሩፑ ላይ ፖስት አደርግላችኋለሁ። እንደገና የዶክተር ደስታንም ሌክቸር ጥያቄዎችንም ሰምታችሁ ኮንቴምፕሌት እያደረግን እንቆይና ሞር ላይት እያገኘን በእያንዳንዱ ሌክቸር እንሄዳለን ብዬ አስባለሁ። ስለዚህ ጥያቄዎች ይቀጥላሉ፣ ኔክስት ታይምም ይኖራል። በአካል